Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be introducing the latest of our transformation seminars. The theme of our transformation seminars is thinking differently about mental health. The seminars provide a public space to explore and reflect on how we might think about the growing problem of child and family mental health. The seminars invite speakers to respond to a very simple question: what is their idea about how to transform children's and families' mental health in the UK? The seminars explore areas beyond clinical interventions, important though they are, to ask how we can think about, understand, and do things differently, individually, collectively, but also as a society. Now, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to our transformation seminar with Ghislaine Kinwanme. The last 18 months, in particular, have seen discussions around race, gender, and marginalization surfacing more publicly than at any time in recent memory. Ghislaine might very reasonably argue that the reason for that is simply that our public spaces are so carefully controlled by those in power. I know today's webinar is going to prompt many of us to rethink our ideas. Indeed, that is what the transformation seminars should do. And I can think of no better person to help us in this task than Ghislaine. Ghislaine Kinwanme is a radical psychologist, a researcher, a feminist, a therapist, an equality consultant, and an award-winning writer. She is adjunct professor of critical psychology at Syracuse University and is completing the final stages of her doctorate in clinical psychology. She is author of Living While Black, The Essential Guide to Overcoming Racial Trauma, which is published by Penguin. A brilliant book, by the way. Ghislaine is French, of African heritage, and her work reflects themes of home and hopelessness, which she has also personally experienced. But she's crystal clear on how power relations which oppress the marginalized have a psychological and cultural force. She talks movingly and powerfully about how the onslaught of disbelief in experience, whether it's hers or the experience of those who she works with or writes about, leads to self-doubt and can destroy what she calls epistemic confidence. She argues that to dismantle self-belief in this way is to sow the seeds of madness. As an activist, Ghislaine wants to change lives, both individually as a therapist and collectively as a writer and an advocate for change. Today, she's talking very much about power bases. The title of this webinar is Whiteness as Pathology, Shifting the Location of Disturbance to Dismantle Social Inequality. This talk comes just as we look forward to October, Black History Month. The power bases that Ghislaine describes, we have their provenance in our history, but they retain their destructive impact in the present. What Ghislaine does so brilliantly is to show how racism can change its shape from overt to covert, but with the same impact of making people ashamed, powerless, and vulnerable. The message that Ghislaine leaves us is one of hope, though. Hope in the face of racial adversity and how others, allies, can support anti-racism to build a better, more inclusive and equitable world. Just before we start, a bit of housekeeping. If you are tweeting us, please use our handle at EFNCCF and use the hashtag Transformation Seminar. We'll talk for about 45, 50 minutes, after which there will be time for Q&A, plenty of time. You can do this by using the chat function on your screen. I'm now honored and delighted to welcome Guylaine to give her seminar for us this evening. Guylaine Gilmonby, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Peter, for the heartfelt and warm introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, possibly one of my highlights this year. But I'm here to speak to you about a theme, about a subject matter that can be quite challenging. I'm here to talk to you about race, about racism, and about whiteness, and how so much of our thinking when it comes to well-being, when it comes to wellness, when it comes to mental health, is essentially centered on white values, on white norms, and white interest. And so I'm hoping to challenge you, but I'm hoping to do so with some compassion, understanding that you are here because you want to, I hope, want to be challenged, and I hope that you want to see things somewhat differently. So let us begin. Here is our rationale for today, and that is from Dressner and Brown. I believe they are counseling psychologists. They are definitely mental health professionals. And they propose as follow. They say selective white privilege amnesia refers to a selective loss of memory that A, denies validation of oppression, B, prevents accountability by the oppressor and bystanders witnessing the oppression, and C, shields the white community from confronting the devastating pain that racism inflicts on communities and individuals of color. White people, they continue, need to experience and acknowledge this pain in order to be mobilized towards action for social justice. And so we are here today to think perhaps together on Black pain, as it is sometimes called, brown pain, but also white pain. Because one thing that I'm going to argue with you today is that whiteness harms white people as much as it harms Black and brown people. And in fact, some of the harm that it inflicts on Black and brown body is the consequence of that unacknowledged and disowned harm. To do this, I have brought with me our reflection model. So this is Rest Reflections, reflective model. Rest Reflections is the social enterprises that I have created, which is dedicated to tackling inequality, injustice, and oppression. And the way that we do that is that we encourage people to engage with their hearts, to engage with their body, and to engage with their mind. And so the invitation today is for you to do so. And to help you do so, the model has been provided. So the presumption is that there's going to be some material that you are going to be presented with today that is going to be challenging intellectually, emotionally, perhaps at different level. And so we want to take account of that challenge, of that discomfort, and to break it down in a way that we hope is going to help you assimilate new knowledge and integrate new information. So this information, or this reflection model rather, is based on different steps that we again invite you to take. We know that when we are confronted with material that challenge us, our body usually lets us know that there is something that is discomforting, that is challenging, that is creating conflict. And so I would like you to pay attention to your body. It's easier for some of us than it is for others to do. Nonetheless, with mindful attention and with deliberation, we can all start to be a bit more conscious when it comes to our own body. So number one, pay attention to your body. Number two, I would like you to pay attention to your feelings, what is happening in relation to emotion or feeling state. How do you feel? What emotion are being activated by the material? It might well be some ideas, might be some story, it might be some concept. So pay attention and connect to your feelings. And so finally, when it comes to engaging, I would like you to pay attention to your thoughts. And so that means connecting more cognitively, more intellectually to the information, to the knowledge, to the material. So to summarize, connect with your body, connect to your feelings, and then connect to your thoughts. So that leaves us with the last two components of the model, and that I like to call the so what part of the model. You've been presented with something that is going to challenge you. On balance, I'm going to expect that you will be able to accept as true about 80% of what I say today. And with that 80%, then the question is, what are you going to do with it? So I invite you to take some time to think about how are you going to integrate, how you are going to integrate and make space and make some place in your worldview when it comes to this new information. Bearing in mind that information that challenge us, we tend not to want to integrate in our worldview. Indeed, that's the reason why it challenges us, because it is asking us to review how we think about ourselves, how we think about the world, and how we think about others. But particularly if you find this information, if you find any aspect of the presentation difficult, then what I would like you to ask yourself is, but what if true? What if true? What might need to shift? What would need to shift in how you view yourself, how you view the world, how you view others, to make some space for that new information? And then finally, hopefully, most of what you are going to meet today, you are going to be able to work with, in which case the last point of the model is asking you, so how are you going to apply? How are you going to apply this new knowledge, those new ideas, this new theory? How are you going to act on what you have been presented today? So I would like you to bear in mind this model. This is generally how we encourage people to engage with our learning. And I hope that it is going to be of help today for you to assimilate the information presented. So we need to start with a definition, basic definition of racism. Here is one. So first of all, I accept that there are various ways to define and to conceptualize racism. Racism is arguably the most complex social structures that we have created. And so therefore, it would be unwise to think that there is just a single way to conceptualize, to formulate, to think about the phenomenon. Nonetheless, in the interest of anti-racism and for the interest of our presentation today, we are going to opt for a more structural definition underpinned by some analytic thinking. So here I say that racism is a socially and historically constructed hierarchical system, which in our context places white group and white adjacent groups in position of dominance and domination over others, and where power is used to maintain privileged access to social, to economic, to cultural, and to educational resources. And we say that this ideology is premised on the alleged superiority of white people, and as such is commonly referred to as white supremacy. So white supremacy in the sociological sense rather than in the layperson understanding, which sometimes can be used as synonymous with white extremism, white nationalism, the KKK, and extremist groups. So we want to think here about white supremacy as the social structure. So sometimes people have really adverse reaction when they hear hierarchy, which posits or position white people at the top, and more or less, all things being equal, Black people at the bottom as underlying the foundation of our society and underlying the foundation of white supremacy. And so I asked them, well, if we deny that this hierarchy is not only operational, but that it is in existence now, and that it is well and alive, or alive and well, then I would like you to I would like you to explain to me why and how come we continue to find that same hierarchy within all systems, all structures that exist in society, in health and in mental health. We'll cover that in some more in a moment. So we know, for example, taking just randomly, say maternity care and outcomes for people who essentially give birth. So we're talking about expectant people. If we look at the data, what does the data suggest in relation to mortality, in relation to morbidity? We find that generally white people who are expecting children, the data is still more or less centered on women, and I understand that it is a problem, but the data that we have is centered on women and cis heterosexual women. And so what do we find is that, well, white women, white people tend to have better outcome than brown people, who tend to have better outcome than Black people. So Black people tend to have the worst outcome. When it comes to education, the same outcome, more or less, if things are equal and we don't add other intersectional axes of identity of oppression. If we look at the criminal justice system, again, what we found generally, all things being equal for the same crime committed, generally, white offenders will have more lenient sentences than Asian, brown offenders would be somewhere in the middle, and Black offenders will have, for the same crime, they will tend to have more strict, longer, more punitive sentences. When it comes to migration, again, the same story: housing, employment, culture, art, and the science. So it becomes very difficult to argue that this hierarchy or this configuration, if we do not want to accept that there is a hierarchy, at least this configuration is just the result of chance alone. I think no one reasonable would really want to argue this case. So how has racism been framed or conceptualized analytically? Firstly, we can start to use the defense mechanism of projection and argue that racism occurs through a projective process whereby the white subject disown parts of themselves and then project those parts onto people of color. And so the racist imagery or imagination is just constructed out of disown elements of the personality or the psyche of white people that are experienced as deeply threatening and therefore not possible to be confronted directly. We could also follow perhaps more of Fanon thinking and argue that the colonial or the Black subject is therefore denied reflection in the eye of the other. that would constitute him as subject. And so that means that colonial power is built on the capacity of the colonizer to remove the source of subjecthood from the colonized, and therefore to turn the colonized or the Black object, the Black subject, into an object. We could also argue that the Black colonial body is phobogenic, tend to attract anxiety, tend to attract phobia, and therefore function as a repository of the white ego, disown, unconscious affects and fantasy, particularly those that are loaded with phobia, including sexuality and mortality, arguably. So if we think about mental health inequalities, I am going to presume that many of us are here because we are interested in mental health and in wellness. What do we know?
Recording stop. Recording in progress.
Thinking about this hierarchy again, all this configuration. So we have lots of data, and we have at least, I would say, 60 years, maybe even more, of data evidencing those findings quite consistently. So we know that Black group and brown group, but particularly Black groups, are more likely to access mental health care through coercive means and through the involvement of the police or the court. We know that that is now an established finding. I would say that is now a fact. We know that Black people, brown people, but again, Black people more than brown people, all things being equal, are more likely to be detained within psychiatric hospital against our will. We know that we are more likely to be assessed or stereotyped as dangerous. We know that we are more likely to be restrained and to die as a result of restraint, either via the police or the mental health services. We know that we are also more likely to be treated medically or via psychotropics medication than to be offered psychotherapy. And that is, again, the case when compared to brown people and compared to white people being, of course, more likely to be offered psychotherapy. We know that we are more likely to spend years rather than having a short encounter with the mental health service and to come in and out of institutions, sometimes referred to as revolving door patients or treatment. Again, more likely to be over medicated, and we are more likely to be diagnosed as having severe and enduring mental health problems, so-called problems, including psychosis. Now, the data varies from study to study, but generally, the agreement is at least 3 times. Some studies would have found up to 7 times, but somewhere between 3 and 7 times more likely to be diagnosed with psychosis. So, as a reminder, we cannot separate mental health inequalities. We cannot separate mental health conceptualization from the social order. Now, here is a little bit of thinking in relation to that link. And so this is from Dr. Cartwright. And he says that it is unknown to our medical authorities, although its diagnosis symptoms, the absconding from service, is well known to our planters and overseers. In noticing a disease not heretofore classed among the long list of maladies that man is subject to, it was necessary to have a new form to express it. The cause in most cases is that it induced the Negro to run away from service. It is as much a disease of the mind as any other species of mental alienation, and much more curable as a general rule, with the advantage of proper medical care strictly followed. This troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented. Although the slaves the slave be located on the borders of free state within a stone throw of abolitionists. So that was a scientific paper at the time, and Dr. Cartwright was a medical doctor. And of course, what you see here is the pathologization of non-compliant slaves. Slave who refuse to be slave who would run away. And the treatment, let's see, what might be the treatment to drapetomania? One man told me that he had sold 41,000 Negroes and that he once cut off a Negro man's leg for running away. I told him that the Christian doctrine taught us not to do unto others as we would that others should do unto us. He then said that this scheme had the desired effect. It cured that man and some others from running away. So we can start to see here the pathology, the dysfunctional, the lack of logic that underscore the ideology of whiteness and the system of white supremacy. Of course, slaves would be less likely to run away if they only have one leg. So, where is the disturbance? I'm going to show you some video, lest we think that the diagnosis of slaves who were running away is a thing of the past, lest we believe that we have stopped locating the disturbance, social disturbance, racial disturbance onto Black and brown bodies. So the question that I would therefore ask you is, as you view this video, is where is the disturbance?
A judge in the U.S. city of Minneapolis has sentenced the former police officer Derek Chauvin to 22.5 years in jail for the murder of George Floyd. The 46-year-old African-American died in May last year after Chauvin knelt on his neck for more than 9 minutes during an arrest. The lawyer for Mr. Floyd's family says the sentence is historic, bringing America a step closer to healing by delivering accountability. Well, our correspondent Neda Taufik is in Minneapolis, and a warning: her report contains some distressing images.
Your Honor, Keith Ellison, Attorney General, on behalf of the state of Minnesota.
This courtroom has been the scene of powerful testimony. Today, it became a place of closure for the Floyd family. The judge began proceedings by inviting them to speak.
Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed with victim input.
His daughter, Gianna, appeared first on video. At just 7 years old, she is too young and innocent to comprehend fully what happened to her father.
It will be, I miss you and I love you.
His brother Terrence struggled to speak as he addressed Derek Chauvin directly.
I wanted to know from the man himself, why? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why when you knew that he posed no threat anymore?
Those are questions that remain unanswered since Derek Chauvin chose not to testify in his defense during his trial. For the first time, the public got a more intimate look into his character from his mother.
It has been difficult for me to hear and read what the media, public, and prosecution team believe Derek to be an aggressive, heartless, and uncaring person. I can tell you that is far from the truth.
And then Derek Chauvin himself spoke.
I want to give my condolences to the Floyd family.
The judge said his decision was not influenced by public opinion or meant to send any messages.
As sentence for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months.
Hands up right now. Let me see your other hand.
It's rare for the justice system to punish a police officer, and it took an extraordinary series of events to get to this moment. Crucially, his murder was caught on camera in chilling detail. George Floyd was pinned to the ground with Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. More than 20 times, Mr. Floyd cried out, "I can't breathe."
I can't believe this. I can't believe this.
It traumatized the community and shocked the world, prompting the biggest protests since the civil rights era.
Mr. McLaughlin, do you need a minute?
The trial was so compelling that the jury delivered a unanimous guilty verdict after just 10 hours of deliberations.
Mom, and get right back in the fight.
This outcome was in no way inevitable. Still, this one sentence of this one disgraced police officer will only do so much to advance racial equality and the struggle of being black in America.
This is the longest sentence a police officer has received in the state of Minnesota. And speaking outside of the courthouse following the sentencing, the family said they do feel some measure of accountability. They hope this is a turning point in America because they feel that the activism surrounding this case could mean real change moving forward. And they told those gathered here outside of the courthouse to keep fighting for justice.
Nada, thank you for that. Nada Tawfiq there, live in Minneapolis.
Okay. Lest we forget.
My son's been murdered, and none of these officers, the justice system, the politicians, nobody cared. These idiots who have murdered my son had more rights than we did. People seem to think I may have moved on and I've got over Stephen's death. I haven't.
122 or 161?
122, man.
How long?
If we'd known that the bus was going to take so long, the 122 to come, we would have just jogged it. If straight ahead of me is 12 o'clock where Stephen's standing, then at 10 o'clock, I remember this group of white boys on the other side of the road shouting,
She ran!
And I just saw this guy strike a downward blow, which I thought was a weapon.
Come on, Steve! Come on, just keep running!
He wasn't running properly, he was running lopsided, and he kept saying to me, Dwayne, like, what's happened to me, what's happened to me?
No, just keep running with me, Brad! Come on with me! No, Steve, man! Come on, please, get up!
On the Saturday morning when I got in, I was made aware that there were phone calls coming in, naming people, but not saying how they knew. Many of the calls were of a similar nature, as if a rumour is going round and people are phoning in the rumour they've heard. Obviously, information isn't evidence. There is a distinct difference. The strategy was not to arrest. There were juveniles. You had to handle juveniles very carefully, obviously. To get them in, to simply release them, wasn't really making a lot of sense.
We're supposed to have our trust in them, and we think they're doing a wonderful job. But that's just a joke, because I don't believe they're doing a wonderful job.
Them times I was really angry, because all the stories that you've heard of what happened to young black men, and then you begin to think about, had he been white?
They would have surrounded the black community, they would have arrested as many black boys as they could, and they would not stop until they get the killer.
We brought over Nelson Mandela to energise the white community. The contrast between the failure of British domestic politicians and the willingness of Nelson Mandela to become involved, I think, tells its own story.
Your tragedy is our tragedy.
Getting Mandela on board changed it from a local story to a national story. More importantly, the next day were the arrests.
I honestly don't believe there was any linkage between Nelson Mandela or anything he said and the timing of the arrests.
Two teenagers accused of murdering the black schoolboy Stephen Lawrence have been released from custody after the Crown Prosecution Service ruled there was insufficient evidence against them.
I was so angry, so angry. The killers were still out on the street. My son had a future, and they've taken that away. And I just feel as if they were laughing at us. There's nobody, I think, who looked to pacify me. Nobody could tell me no. I presume they could, but I wouldn't accept it.
Okay, and a final video, just so that we remember that actually those issues are still alive and well in the present.
A nurse for 20 years, Rosemarie McLaughlin lived in the UK, worked in the UK, but 5 years ago wasn't able to die here. Like so many members of the so-called Windrush generation, her status and the administrative confusion it brought blighted her life. And from the 1980s, when she started to live outside the UK in Jamaica for extended periods, it made her citizenship even more complex.
This is her original certificate for her nurse training.
So when she wanted to return to Britain and her family as her health began to fail, she wasn't allowed.
She's cared for, you're sick. Why should she not be cared for? And how many applications does she have to make for, to be refused? And why should she be when all of us are living here, we're born here, we're here because of my grandfather. And this thing about immigrants, don't call us immigrants, we were invited here.
The Windrush fiasco continues to throw up new injustices. Today we learnt that the families of 3 Windrush migrants who died after they were removed from Britain are to receive a personal apology from the Home Secretary. Sajid Javid will write to their relatives and will do the same to 15 others who may have been wrongfully removed or detained. But how many other cases might there be?
There'll be many more thousands of people, not only who were wrongly deported, but were denied their entitlement to British citizenship with a right of abode, and they have suffered indignity and economic loss as a consequence. So for the government, it's not merely a question of issuing an apology. When a government doesn't apply the law correctly and that creates a wrong in people's lives, then that government has to compensate them.
The case of Rosemarie McLaughlin doesn't fall within the terms of wrongful removal, so her family won't be receiving an apology. Her daughter says she was never expecting one.
Our family is not a family that seek, public sympathy, or we're a very proud family, and this is why this is extremely hard for me to do as well. It's appalling, it's past appalling. I live every day this with the consequences of what's happened to my mother, and it deeply has affected my health.
The Home Secretary has vowed to right the wrongs that occurred to the Windrush generation. But Rosemarie's family stress nothing can change the pain she went through. Julian Drucker, 5 News, Birmingham.
Okay, so a little bit of a shocking image, as I want to now make the case that white people are not the healthy norm. We are socially educated to believe that we are simply socialized to believe. Here you have an image, quite standard image that you will find on most history book looking into lynching events. And so that is a lynching scene. And what you can see, of course, is in addition to the hanging black bodies, is smiles and pride and a sense of satisfaction from the murdered black bodies. So how can we as a society continue to act as though there isn't a serious dysfunction, there isn't a serious problem in the way that whiteness has been constructed, in the way that it continues to operate, and in the way that it needs to function psychically, psychologically, in order to keep the system going. So here are some of the psychological processes that I am going to argue sustain social inequality and power configuration along racial line. We've had the quote around amnesia. We started the presentation on those words. And I told you that part of the aim of the presentation was to essentially make you see, make you remember. Hence the disturbing material. So here are some of the processes, psychic, possibly individual or more individualistic or personal processes that are engaged. Sadism, white sadism. You will hear me say the word white quite frequently. I promise you there is logic. It's not madness, right? Feel free to ask me that question at the end. So I speak about white sadism. Obviously, when we have scene of great violence, suffering, and pain, and we can post picture or smile, we know that there are some motives here that are below simply racism, that goes really deep into the satisfaction, the gratification that violence against Black and brown body can activate in white groups. Of course, we need a level of denial, because seeing the violence involved in white supremacy means that we have to confront our so-called intellectual or moral superiority, which is inconsistent, incompatible with acts of gross racial violence. So we do need a level of denial. We need a level of dissociation. Why dissociation? Because as human beings, I fundamentally believe that we are built, we are designed to connect to people's emotional world, and so therefore to people's pain. So we have to socialize ourselves out of this connection. So we have to learn to disconnect. And one way that we learn to disconnect is to master the art of dissociating from pain. We need a level of silence so that when acts of violence, of aggressions, of injustice are carried out by a few people who I would say are acting on behalf of a lot more, they are not challenged. They are accepted. And so that leads us to issues of ambivalence and complicity, because of course I do believe that there is some motivation, there is some aspiration and some ambition even to tackle racial injustice and inequality in society. That is on. What is not on is that there is also a lot of motivation to ensuring that the status quo remains the status quo. And so therefore, that would mean that violence remains the status quo. And so therefore, that would mean that Black and brown people continue to be oppressed and marginalized in the way that we have started to cover. And so that makes us complicit. And I say as in an act of compassion, of course. And we have white trauma, because we need to remember again that one needs not be the target of act of violence or traumatic or overwhelming experience to be overwhelmed, to be traumatized, and to be harmed by the state violence. In fact, we have quite a bit of empirical studies that suggest that committing acts of violence also increases our propensity or vulnerability to trauma responses. So everybody gets hurt, everybody essentially is harmed. And then finally, we need splitting. And so we're going to put the spotlight on splitting and unpack it a little bit more. And here we need to think about splitting, of course, in relation to whiteness. And I'm going to put to you that whiteness relies quite heavily on the defense mechanism of splitting. But essentially what it is that we mean when we are talking about splitting, we are talking about difficulty in integrating. So when we split, we separate or we disconnect thoughts, feelings, belief, entity, people, and set them as polar opposite or as mutually exclusive or incompatible binaries. So splitting is essentially the root of all binary thinking. So we can see evidence of splitting in colonial logics, for example, race construction, which proposes that white groups are civilized and that Black and brown groups or the colonial object is primitive. So we have a nice binary construction here. around advancement, or around civilization, if we prefer. And then we can think of splitting in relation to colonial tactics, the tactics that have been well used, tried and tested historically, of divide and rule. We can see that tactic in operation today when it comes to how certain group of people of color are constricted as good objects and others as bad objects. So you have the good migrant, of course, and you have the bad migrants, and you have the deserving migrant and the non-deserving migrants. So you have the good black, and then you have the bad black. All that, I would argue, is linked very, very fundamentally to divide and rule tactics. And then we can even see that same splitting in Cartesian logic, the split between the mind and the body, so-called dualism. That also is dependent on construction or formulation of individualism. So we extract the person from its environment, from its relationship, from other people, from history. That, I would argue, is another act of splitting. And then we have the Western time orientation, which continues to maintain the illusion that there is a strong, strict distinction between the past and the present. What kind of collective processes we could argue sustain social inequality and therefore power configuration? Back to Fanon. Fanon speaks of processes of internalization or epidermization of the social world, and this is when both social and historical reality become assimilated internally. So they become part of us, they enter us and become part of our subjective reality. So that economic, for example, socioeconomic inferiority becomes a state of ontological inferiority. So we feel inferior because we are positioned as inferior when it comes to socioeconomic systems, for example. Then we could use the social unconscious, a group analytic idea that refers to how we internalize social configuration, which then become invisible to us, and how we internalize the properties of the world that we are essentially blind to, that we lack a conscious awareness of, certainly lack conscious awareness of from moment to moment. We could use the idea of intergenerational trauma. Various definitions exist. I've chosen here Braveheart's definition, and she proposes that intergenerational trauma is a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding that happens across generation, including the last span, and that emanates from massive group trauma. That's one way to think about it. As I said, there are plenty others. And finally, and quite centrally to what we are talking about today, another group analytic idea, that of location of disturbance, which proposes that what becomes manifest in any system, in any group, within any institution, any nation, any society, may be symptomatic of a disturbance that is located elsewhere, in some other part or part of the same. And that disturbance actually is located in the group as a whole, or exists between different groups or different individuals, even though it becomes observable in particular individual, will become, if you like, the site of the disturbance. A little bit, you might say, when you might go and see your GP because you have a headache, it doesn't necessarily mean that the symptom, right, the headache, the pain that you're experiencing in your head necessarily means that it is the head that needs attention. It might well be that you have problem with your liver, or that you have problem elsewhere in your, for example, nerve. So this is the idea of location of disturbance. So why we need to think about mental health, I would argue we need to redefine what it means to be mentally healthy. We need to make difference between distress and disorder. I tend to argue that people who are marginalized are not disordered, they are distressed. And people in position of power are in fact the people who are disordered. But what do we know from what exists in the literature is that mental health discipline generally have been absent from conceptualization of whiteness and racism, and when they have been present, have tended to focus on the harm that is inflicted by those systems of power on people of color. And what I want to suggest is that this absence is not coincidental, of course, but more than not being coincidental and being functional, it is a form of violence, very specifically a form of epistemic violence that ensures the reproduction of whiteness as a system, while we continue to say that we are working towards diversity and inclusion. So it allows us to have back again that split between discourse and action. And so to feel good and to feel morally consistent with our ideas or our value while behaving in a way that essentially contradicts everything that we say we want. So those who define the world tend to create the world and therefore organize the world. Like drapetomania, it was the slave running away who was pathological. It was not the slave holder or the slave master. And we had battered wife syndrome. We didn't have violent husband syndrome. That's important. That tells you where we tend to shift the dysfunction, where we tend to pay attention. And so definition of mental health have tended to be centered on white colonial, cis hetero normative values and assumption. We have essentially a mental health system that works hand in hand with white supremacy, and therefore that works towards ensuring that the system of whiteness is maintained. And I would argue that we are all colluding in that. And so to disrupt projective processes, particularly when it comes to thinking around location of disturbance, social harm must be seen as contingent upon white social actors functioning psychologically, psychically, but also functioning structurally. And indeed, those of us who are clinicians, who work with people, whether you work with people who have been harmed by racial trauma, by abuse, or any form of injustice, and I would argue that injustice is the root cause of mental health distress, then we want to think about how we work towards disentangling people who are socially disadvantaged, people with less social power, from the internalization of pathology, and thus from projective identification processes. And that is why I say we need to shift the gaze. And as a reminder, this is where we are, this is where we started. The direction of the gaze is the direction of power. Always, right, the person who is doing the gazing is going to be the person with the power. Finally, I'm taking you back to the rest reflections reflective model. We started with your body. I'm sure there has been some embodied responses in the room. Then I invited you to connect to your feelings and your emotion. I hope you have been able to do that. Finally, I ask you to think, to connect to concepts, ideas, images that might have been evoked by what I have spoken about today. And then the last two parts of the reflective model were the so what factor. If you remember, if true, if true, and I'm hoping that you will be able to accept most of what I've presented today, if not all, as true, that if you struggle, if true, what would be the implication? What would need to shift in your worldview for you to make space for that reframing of what it means to be mentally healthy, what it means to be psychologically disordered, so to speak. And finally, if you're able to accept some of what I've spoken about today, what are you going to do about it? As we know, action, change things. Thank you very much for your attention.
Absolutely brilliant, Gern. Absolutely brilliant. So persuasive, so powerful, and so difficult, because here am I, I'm a person, I'm chief executive, I'm a person with power. And what you're suggesting is really that it is the person in power who is primarily responsible for allowing and encouraging and in many ways abetting a hierarchical structure that causes mental health problems. So here I am, chief executive of the Anna Freud Center, a mental health, so-called mental health charity for children and young people. But by being part of what I think you so persuasively describe as a pathogenic system, I am as much part of the cause, maybe more, than I am part of the solution. So it's, if I may say, it's not just the heart, it's a body blow, if you like, to the way we view ourselves and our privilege. And there is much that really needs to be said about it. And what I think you do so well in your talk is to do what kind of psychoanalytic thinking does best, in my view, is to look exactly to where one doesn't want to see, one doesn't want to look, and try and suggest that by looking at where it's uncomfortable, you may make the biggest progress, the most significant progress. So I think we owe you a debt of gratitude. There are lots of questions. We're not going to have time for all of them, but I'd quite like to ask you a few, if I may. Okay? So one question is a simple one. You mentioned white adjacent communities. Can you be a little bit more specific what you mean by white adjacent communities?
White, sorry, Peter, I didn't hear the first word.
White adjacent communities. You mentioned white adjacent communities, close to white.
White adjacent. Okay, sorry, that's how I pronounce it. Sorry if that's not the right pronunciation. White adjacency or white proximity would be a synonymous. So when I'm talking about white adjacency or white proximity, I'm back to the hierarchy or the construction, the racial construction of white supremacy, which place again, overall, all things being equal, white people at the top of the hierarchy, and overall, all things being equal, black people at the bottom of the hierarchy. But there's lots of movement in between those poles. We know that whiteness is not fixed. We know that groups who have been historically constructed as brown have shifted and have become white. And so when we're talking about white adjacency, we're talking about those groups which at any point in time sit closer to the top of the hierarchy, sit closer to whiteness.
Okay, so this in principle could include people of color, depending on where they position themselves in that hierarchy. Is that correct?
Correct. So I would generally say all non-Black people of color would be somewhere in the middle there. But then even amongst those groups, there would be particular hierarchy as well, because hierarchical thinking gives birth to other hierarchical thinking. So this is when the situation becomes more complex, because I have essentially speaking in a way that is fairly arguably one-dimensional, but we know that race is gendered, we know that race is class. And so when we add those axes of identity of oppression, then the situation become more murky. So for example, if we think about the criminal justice system, when I say that all things being equal, which is not even true actually, because things within the criminal justice system can get even more perverse, where we can find white offenders with less favorable indices of criminality. So people, for example, who have committed multiple offenses, or who have less stable housing or employment situation, if they are white, they are less likely to, for example, either being given a custodial sentence or to be given a lengthy custodial sentence when compared to Black and brown offenders who might not have a similarly adverse history when it comes to the forensic system, or we may have more stable housing and employment situation. So you can see how whiteness becomes really a protective factor within systems. But if you add religion into the mix and you start to look at what happened, then things shift slightly. So you may find that brown offenders who are Muslim or who are of the Muslim faith tend to fare worse than some Black offenders who are not Muslim. So that's why I say all things being equal, whiteness is arguably the most effective cause of social outcome, all things being equal. And when we add other axes of identity and oppression, things become a bit more complicated.
Okay, now a question that's kind of related to that comes from someone who is East Asian and who often feels that issues of race do not include people like them, whether that's purposefully or due to language which isn't inclusive. Do you have a view about that? That it's Black and brown that represent non-whiteness and not excludes East Asians. Is it that kind of a white adjacent community, or how do you see that?
I don't know necessarily that I would agree. I can see the sentiment, so I can see where it's coming from. But what I would say is that there is a lot of ambivalence. This is the key defense when it comes to people located in the middle. So they tend to have a lot more to lose when it comes to racial consciousness, when it comes to engaging in social justice activism, because they are positioned in the middle. And so they're not at the bottom. So there's always the risk that they might lose out and so drop out a little bit when it comes to that hierarchy. And I think that kind of explains some of the absence that I think the person asking the question might be about, because within our society, certainly in this country, a lot more in the States, people of Eastern Asian ancestry are constructed as the ideal minority. They are constructed often as the good migrant, and so benefit somewhat from where they are positioned within white supremacy, certainly benefit above other racially constructed or racialized group. And I think that ambivalence needs to be spoken about, particularly when we know that there is a lot of anti-Blackness within all the people in the middle as well. So I think things are complicated. I think it's not necessarily that Black or racial scholars erase East Asian. I think there's lots of literature, particularly in the Global South, around equality and racial equality. But I do think that we have a core issue of ambivalence within people who are positioned in the middle, and that would include people of East Asian ancestry.
I'm going to ask you a challenging question, a difficult question. Okay, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. But it's one that somebody asked, but I find it pertinent. Do you have any hope that white supremacy, as you've described it, will ever be dismantled and replaced with a structure that releases Black people and all the others from the tyranny?
Do I have any hope? Was that the question?
Yes, the question is hope. And then, hold on, what are the steps from here?
Okay, so that's the more complicated question.
Yeah, that's
so in relation to hope, yes, I do have hope, but I do say always that hope is a choice. Hope is part of the work. We would not be resisting, we would not be attempting to change anyone or any structure if we believe that it was hopeless. I think in order to connect to life, we need to connect to hope. So I do make the decision deliberately to hold on to hope. That is a political choice. So it's very important for people to remember that. When it comes to the step that must be taken, they are at multi-level. The way that I tend to think about race, about oppression, about any systems of domination is that it is reproduced at so many levels, at individual level, at relational level, at institutional level, at structural level, at maybe even social unconscious or symbolical level. It is at multiple levels. And so I believe that the most effective action to dismantling, to changing the system is going to be action that tackle those multiple levels. What can you do for yourself to address your bias, to address your prejudices, to address your internalized racism? That's one thing. What can you do to challenge things that are happening in the team, within your family groups, within the settings where people are coming together? What can we do within the institution when it comes to processes, when it comes to adverse impact, when it comes to policy that are likely to exclude, that are likely to harm? Then what can we do structurally? And those levels are arguably illusions, but nonetheless they give us entry point to think about how do we operationalize anti-racism. And so I do think that it is action that is multidimensional and multi-level that is most likely to be effective. Having said that, it is tough work, and it is work that requires sustained action and engagement. So it's not work that we can do after one day, 1 week, 1 month training. It's work that we have to do throughout our lifetime. And so this is where we lose 90% of us, right? Because it's difficult, it's demanding. It's not a job that you can say, I've completed the job, I'm done now, sign off and go to bed. It's work that you have to commit to for the rest of your life. And it is hard work. And so you can see that it's us getting in the way, nothing else, ourselves.
Thank you for that. Hope with a touch of hopelessness as well with it. It's very well put. You're talking to many mental health professionals out there, so this question is really quite pertinent, and I wonder whether you can help. How can we integrate non-white understandings of mental health difficulties into our practice?
There's been a lot of writing, a lot of thinking that has been done, particularly in the global south, around reclaiming so-called more traditional ways of healing, more traditional ways of being in the world. And I talk a little bit about some of them in the book. For example, a connection to the body, dancing, drumming, connecting to nature, all those kind of things that we have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. I think we need to reclaim them. I think we also need to seek expertise in people who are doing healing differently. I think that is important. But I would say at the core of it is humility. I think part of being born within a dominant system, part of being, born in the center, part of being born in the mainstream is really an ingrained sense of superiority. That is what we're dealing with. So the notion that people in other parts of the world, the way that they think, the way that they operate, is simply inferior. It's something that we can discount. So we come back to humility and how important it is to genuinely believe that we can learn from anyone and everyone, and that's important. And I think that's really the blocker. I think it is that lack of humility.
This gets me very neatly to the next question. What about white narcissism?
How long do you have? Well, it's part of it all, but we have to remember that narcissism is a defense as well. So why do white people need narcissism? That is the real question. What is it that we are defending against? So maybe if we can connect and we can engage with what is being defended, right? The sense of inferiority, the sense of not being good enough, the pain, the not knowing, all the kind of stuff that omnipotence kind of give us a defense against, then we can start to connect to what's going on in the white mind. Yeah.
Linked to that slightly, do you think that both racial trauma, but also the pathology that you describe in relation to white people, should this somehow be included in a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders?
Oh, I said yes too quickly. So no, my response would be no. And my response would be that I don't know that we necessarily need a diagnostic statistical manual anyway. That is being wedded to a very particular worldview, biomedical conceptualization of distress. That has its pros and cons, but certainly doesn't serve the marginalized, has never served the marginalized, I would say. And so I don't think that the way forward is to including more stuff into whiteness, right? I think the way forward is to dismantle whiteness and not to make space for other stuff within its remit.
But that's, listen, you have been superb. You've been absolutely superb, and a very tough message, but somehow you delivered it in a way that although our bodies, our hearts and our minds, I hope, responded, I do think we are a little bit closer to feeling that we can do something about it, that we are able to address it in our own minor ways, to actually say, look, there is an aspect to what you do as a white person that is not right and is not mentally healthy, and that not to look at what just the impact that you're having on others, but look at the motives, the feelings, the desires, the wishes that make you do those terrible things, that you're willing to condone in yourself implicitly, even though explicitly you find those attitudes abhorrent, which is what psychoanalysis and psychodynamic thinking is all about. So I want to thank you for making something that was really quite a difficult subject really much easier for us to actually take forward. And now, talking to those of you who are listening, we hope very much that you've enjoyed the seminar, which is delivered as part of our commitment to providing free and accessible events to all those with an interest in social justice and who support children and young people. That we understand that during this difficult time, you may be interested in how you might be able to help us to continue our services for children and young people and their families. And if you're able to, and if you enjoyed this seminar, you can donate to the Centre through the website. Go to annafreud.org and click on the green donate button and on the top right-hand side of the page. But whether you do that or not, thank you so much for joining us, because together we can improve the lives of thousands of children and families in the UK and beyond. Our next transformation seminar will be on the 2nd of November when Professor Paul Ramchandani will talk on can we make prevention in mental health really work. So I hope that I'll see you there. But before that, Ilan, from the bottom of my heart, I really want to thank you, not just for today's seminar, but really from, I hope, many of us, for what you do, what you write, what you research, and what you practice. It's very important, and the message couldn't be more important than it is at the moment. Thank you for being the messenger, and thank you for the elegant and persuasive way that you do it. So with that, thank you and good evening, good night.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone.